When we come together to discuss, it would be good to hear what you think of the main points of that confession. And also, having today read several other confessions, how are they similar to Zwingli's ideas, the ideas that came out at Marburg? It might also be interesting to compare them with the Anabaptist confession that you read earlier today as well. Not everyone was happy with this Geneva Confession of Faith, and the council were hesitant to enforce it. I wonder why you think they were hesitant to do that. On the 26th of November, Farel and Calvin had a heated debate with the council over the issues. Now, there was also the fact that they were both French, and so their loyalty to Geneva was questioned. And at that point, Geneva was seeking an alliance with the city of Bern, and Bern was looking for uniformity in church practices. Bern proposed the use of unleavened bread in communion. Farel and Calvin argued for a synod to be convened in Zurich to debate this and continue to use ordinary bread. The council ordered them to use unleavened bread for the Easter Eucharist. In protest, they refused to administer communion at all, since they rejected the authority of the council over church practices. But this refusal of communion caused a riot in the church. Everybody had been de facto excommunicated by Calvin and Farel. And the next day, the council ordered Farel and Calvin to leave Geneva. So they went off. They went to Zurich, and the synod that they'd sought was held. And it was actually rather critical of them for their lack of sympathy to the people of Geneva. Bern was asked to mediate with the council at Geneva and to aid their return. But the Geneva Council felt it was well rid of them. Moving on to Basel, Calvin was then invited to lead a church for French refugees in Strasbourg by Martin Bucer and Wolfgang Capito, that city's leading reformers. Farel was invited to lead a church in Neuchâtel. So, from September 1538, Calvin stayed in Strasbourg, and expecting to stay there for quite a lot longer, he applied for and was granted citizenship. While ministering to about 400 members of his congregations in Strasbourg, Calvin worked on a second edition of the Institutes, and that was published in 1539. He decided now for a more systematic approach, and the book was expanded to 17 chapters. He also worked on his commentary on Romans, which was published in March 1540. This book set him in his style for dealing with scripture. What he did was translate the passage from the Greek, and then he added an exegesis, which is an explanation of each verse, and an exposition, an explanation of the whole passage and its implications for his hearers or readers. Calvin's friends encouraged him to marry, and so eventually he married a woman on the condition that she learnt French. One was proposed, but that one didn't go through. But in August 1540, he married the widow of an Anabaptist preacher, Idelette de Boer, who had 2 children from her first marriage. With Calvin, she had 3 further children, but none of them survived infancy. Back in Geneva, the mood had changed. Geneva fell out with Bern over a land dispute, and the makeup of the city council was different. Attendance at the church was waning, and so Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto wrote to the city council to invite Calvin back. Cardinal Jacopo Sadoleto wrote to the city council to invite Geneva back into the Catholic fold. And the council didn't really know who to write back to him, who to argue for their position as a reformed city. And they decided eventually they needed Calvin for the job. And so he wrote his response to Sadoleto and sent it to them. An emissary was sent to Calvin, who was at that point at a colloquy at Worms, to bring him back to Geneva. His response was, "Rather would I submit to death 100 times than to that cross on which I had to perish daily 1,000 times over." Yet he also said he would follow the Lord's calling, and dutifully returned on the 13th of September 1541. Having been returned, he got set to on reforming the church in Geneva. He got to work fast, and the council passed his ecclesiastical ordinances on the 20th of November 1541. There were to be 4 orders of ministers: doctors, who would teach the faith; pastors, who were to preach and administer the sacraments; deacons, who would care for the poor and needy; and elders, to provide discipline. A consistoire, or consistory court, was created, composed of pastors and elders, and that was to judge in ecclesiastical matters. The city council would retain the power to summon people to appear before the consistory court, but church matters would be decided by a church court, not by the city council. The matter would then be passed to the city council for the appropriate sentence to be passed. Offences included adultery, illicit marriages, cursing, unauthorized luxury, disrespect in church, and comportment bearing traces of the old faith, such as regarding the Virgin Mary as patroness. Scholars have so far sampled only some of the many cases handled by the consistory, so the list I'm about to read out should be viewed as suggestive of about 5% of the total cases. They included relapses to Catholicism, 39 instances; blasphemy, 28; general disrespect and complaining about Calvin and his rule, 62; games of chance, 36; immorality, 13; insulting French immigrants, 9; dancing and unseemly singing, 12; absence from worship and catechetal instruction, 10; issues of faith, 7; suicide attempt, sadly 1. It is this effort at the control of morals normed by Scripture that has led some to call Geneva a bibliocracy. No other institution deserves more credit for shaping in Geneva that particularly austere style of life we have come to label as Puritan, and that's from Kingdom 1993, and that's been cited by Carter Lindbergh. A service book was produced in 1542, much like the one Calvin had already prepared and used in Strasbourg. The form of prayers and church hymns was to be used across the city. Calvin recognised the value of a good tune in helping people to remember Scripture, and so wrote hymnic version of the Psalms. Other refugees helped with writing for the church, including Louis Bourgeois, who wrote the Old Hundredth. We sing this in translation as "all people that on earth do dwell." Not everyone in Geneva appreciated the new order. A group who referred to themselves as the Spirituels, or Patriots, but whom Calvin called the Libertines, started to protest in 1546. They were wealthy and politically powerful people. Calvin accused them of believing that once you were saved by grace, you were free from all law, whether civil or ecclesiastical. One of them, an erstwhile playing card maker, whose wares did not sell in a Geneva that had forbidden games of chance, Pierre Amiot, accused Calvin of being a Picard, a derogatory term for a Frenchman, accused him of teaching false doctrine. Others resented the strictures on dancing. 27th of June 1547, an unsigned letter in the Genevan dialect was found in the pulpit of Saint-Pierre Cathedral, which is where Calvin preached. The city council was concerned that they, as well as the church, were under attack, and so appointed a commission to investigate. A member of the Libertines, Jacques Prouet, was arrested and under torture confessed to several crimes, including writing the letter. He was beheaded on the 26th of July. Despite this, the Libertines slowly gained political power, and by July 1553, Calvin thought he was defeated. He offered his resignation to the council. The council refused it, for while they wanted to keep him in check, they realised that the people would not accept Calvin being banished. And that is where we come to the affair around Michael Servetus. On the 13th of August 1553, a Spaniard, Servetus, arrived in Geneva. He was a polymath. In science, he discovered the circulation of blood to the lungs, and he also wrote on theology. In particular, he denounced the doctrine of the Trinity as unbiblical. Calvin had been exchanging letters with him since 1546 under a pseudonym. When Calvin sent him his Institutes of Christian Religion, Servetus returned it heavily annotated, pointing out what he saw as the errors of the book. As well as rejecting the Trinity, Servetus also attacked the doctrine of predestination. Now, up to this point, it was probably a fairly minor point in Calvin's theology. He'd accepted the idea that Paul speaks of, that those who will be saved have been destined to be so by God. And this was fairly uncontested by theologians of the age. Calvin saw it as a comfort. If your salvation is so destined by God, then even if you don't feel worthy of it, it's still going to happen. I'm going to read quite an extended passage from Nick Page because I think he explains quite well how Calvin goes from that general point to double predestination being so important to him. So Nick Page says, it's not that he was preaching anything radically new. Calvin believed that God elected those whom he intended to save, but so did Augustine, so did Thomas Aquinas. What differed with Calvin and those who followed him and interpreted his works was that he looked unblinkingly at the logical consequences of election. God's in charge of everything, isn't he? So if he's decided that some are elected to salvation, then he must have decided also the fate of the rest. Or as the chapter heading has it, of the eternal election, by which God has predestinated some to salvation and others to destruction. It begins, like the Institutes themselves, with an affirmation of God's majesty and authority. Whatever happened in human history has to be not only known about, but ordained by God. Salvation, especially, was in God's hands. As Luther had repeatedly argued, human works were of no avail. So logically, if someone becomes a Christian, they are elect. God has chosen them to be saved. But if God has chosen some people to be saved, then yep, it's called double predestination. Calvin believed that from all eternity, God predestined some men to salvation because of his goodness, and predestines most to hell because of his justice. God has chosen who will be saved and who will be damned, and there's not much that you can do about it. And what is more, he has created swathes of human beings knowing that they would be damned. Calvin didn't blink. He looked into the logic of predestination, dispassionately confronting its darker side, and endorsed it. Luther typically agreed with double predestination, salvation and damnation from the beginning of time, but he chose not to talk about it. Melanchthon didn't like the idea at all, and pretty much deleted it from the Augsburg Confession. And most Lutherans followed Melanchthon in downplaying the idea. How did you decide who was in and who was out, though? Well, you couldn't, not really. You could only look at people's response. If they responded to the word and acted on it, then they must have been elected. If they didn't, well, not so elected. Then, for Calvin, this showed the majesty of God, but then it was okay for him, because he's in the elect. This also handily explained the failure of the Reformation in areas like France. It was not so much a disappointing failure as predestined. The doctrine of election thus became a great comfort to people who felt ostracized, outcast, and abused. It wasn't because they were wrong, it was because the other side were not elect. And like all groups who consider themselves chosen, it began a process which continues to this day, an endless splintering of just who is chosen and who isn't. And that's from Nick Page's A Nearly Infallible History of the Reformation. In 1553, Servetus published his The Restoration of Christianity, rejecting both the Trinity and predestination. Calvin, on receiving a copy, notified the French Inquisition. They discovered Servetus had gone to Vienna and so notified the Inquisition, who had him imprisoned there. But he managed to escape. In his absence, he was sentenced to the heretic's death by burning. Now, he was passing through Geneva on his way to Italy, hoping to find somewhere safe there, when he turned up at Calvin's church. He was arrested and tried by the council. The libertines thought it would cause Calvin a problem if the trial dragged on, but the other cities about were watching. So the council decided to write to other Swiss cities for their views in August, and on the 20th of October replies from Zurich, Basel, Bern and Schaffhausen came, and they said that Servetus was a heretic. So he was condemned and burnt at the stake on the 27th of October. After this, Calvin was seen as a defender of Christianity. By 1555, many of the French émigrés in Geneva had been granted citizenship, and so those libertines had been voted off the city council. Some people protested, and they were either exiled or executed. Calvin's authority was not questioned again. And from 1555, English Protestants fleeing Mary Tudor's reign came to Geneva. John Knox of Scotland also came, and an English-speaking congregation was formed. They took the ideas back to Scotland and England. Calvin's final edition of the Institutes was finished in 1559, now with 80 chapters. He died in May 1564. At his own request, he was buried in an unmarked grave. He wanted to avoid the growth of a saint's cult around his grave.